Very warm welcome to everybody this evening, or this morning if you happen to be in New Zealand, or anywhere else the other side of the world. I'm delighted. My name's Hamish Chalmers. I'm a co-director of the Oxford Education Deanery. The Deanery is the arm of the Department of Education here at Oxford that is responsible for bringing practitioners, stakeholders, teachers, policymakers and other educators together with researchers and the people who produce research so that we can all help each other to understand and put into practice the findings of research. I'm just going to do a quick little plug on that one. If you'd like to, I've put in the chat a link to our website. So if you'd like to find out about more events that we're doing, including more on sustainability and climate, but also all sorts of other aspects of the outputs of the Department of Education, then please take a look at that. I'm also just going to put into the chat the link to where you will find the materials that our colleagues here are going to talk about if you haven't managed to download those prior to the start of this session. So again, to reiterate, my warmest welcomes to everybody here. I hope you have a fantastic webinar and you learn a lot and that the discussion is fruitful, interesting and productive. Just to remind you that this is being recorded. We will make the recording available to everybody afterwards, but just to let you know, if you would prefer not to be seen on that recording, then please feel free to turn your camera off. Otherwise, I shall hand over to Dr. Travis Fuchs, who is going to be chairing this session, who will introduce you to the rest of the panel, and I wish you the very most excitingness of webinars.
Perfect. Thanks, Hamish. So hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. We're going to be talking through some lessons that we've designed that are in partnership with the Right Here, Right Now Summit. We're going to be talking through some lessons that try to tie human rights and climate justice and climate litigation and attribution science. So it's going to be a really, really exciting webinar that we'll take you through today. So as Hamish said, my name is Travis Fuchs. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Brock University in Canada, as well as an honorary Norm fellow over at the University of Oxford. With us today is also Phoebe Mortimer. She's a sustainability lead at the River Learning Trust. You can probably see her name, so she doesn't need to wave. We have Shireen Ermis. She's a DPhil candidate at Oxford, as well as our resident attribution scientist expert. And then we also have Isabella Lenahan-Eichen, who is also a DPhil candidate at the University of Oxford and is our climate litigation and justice expert. So together, we're going to walk you through some of these lessons. Now, our team is also from some pretty diverse places and backgrounds with diverse histories of the land we reside on and are taking care of. So I want to acknowledge for myself that I'm a settler on treaty land in Canada. So that's treaty land number 3 between the Lakes Treaty, which has a rich history of the Hattawanderack, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe peoples, including the Mississaugas of the Credit. And they've been gathering on these lands for millennia to talk about how best to care for it. And I think it's really nice that we're gathering, although virtually, to talk about similar things. So I do invite you right now, either silently or in the chat, to acknowledge the true caretakers of the land in which you reside on, as we remember what we're kind of doing all this for. So lots a lot to do today. So to give us a little bit of an introduction, I'm going to start to share my screen and then hand it over to Phoebe as we begin to walk through. So classic test. Can we see this? Yeah, okay. Excellent. Thank you. Thanks, Andrew. Okay, over to you, Phoebe.
Okay, great. So the idea is that I'm going to talk you through the kind of intent of the lessons and how we might teach them. But before we go there, I wanted first to speak a bit about the framing and language we might use as we teach these lessons and talk to our young people about the climate and nature crisis. So we need to recognise the full range of ways people are directly affected by the climate and nature crisis. Here in Oxford, where I am, perhaps that might be because it exacerbates existing problems, poorly ventilated or damp-prone housing, those in families struggling to meet rising food costs, those from farming backgrounds, but also perhaps those with loved ones in more climate vulnerable parts of the world, the Philippines, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sudan. There are big communities from all of those countries in my school in Oxford. We're also going to have students who are actively engaged with the crisis and in a state of anxiety. And then there will be those for whom it is just too big to think about and their defense mechanism is to avoid it. And in those cases, I'm thinking just about here where I am in the UK, and of course, wherever you might be in the rest of the world, there might be many more pressing versions of those issues. So of course, we always have a duty of care to think about the range of needs in our classrooms as teachers, and also to recognise that students are naturally looking to us for reassurance and for an example of how to respond to the situation we're in. So our recommendation is that you use language that acknowledges that this is a shared problem, so talking about our planet, our weather, that you talk pragmatically about efforts to fix and mend and heal, and that you avoid fatalistic or dramatic language, especially that which presents our global predicament as a war or a battle that young people must fight. So in summary, we don't want to burden young people, we want to equip them. Okay, so there are 5 lessons in total, and Travis is just going to give you a little overview before I talk a bit more about how we might go about actually teaching them.
Perfect. Thanks, Phoebe. So the 5 lessons, when we kind of sat down and thought about this, we were really trying to get at an overarching inquiry question of how can my rights be protected in a changing world? And then these 5 lessons try to pick at that from kind of different angles, and what we're thinking is some logical sequence. So the first lesson really tries to answer, what are your rights in climate change? And this is when we start to think about the rights of the child, as well as the rights of young people. In the second lesson, we think about how might your rights be infringed upon as young people in climate change. This is really where we're trying to take more of a justice angle, thinking about intergenerational justice as a way of talking about these rights. The third lesson then thinks about what can we do about this? So what is a process to secure your rights in this changing world? And we're going to introduce climate litigation as a possible process to do this. The fourth lesson then thinks about the evidence that you use in that process. So what evidence can be used to support the litigation process? And this is where we'll bring in attribution science. And then the last one is thinking about how can we tie this all together? And the way we're trying to tie it together for this last one was thinking about careers in these various subfields. So those are kind of our arcs. Back over to you, Phoebe.
Okay, so back to how we might teach them. Okay, I'm just going to run through some general principles and invite you to sort of adapt them to fit your needs. Okay, so first of all, timing. We encourage you, of course, to expand or contract the lessons as you see fit. At my school, we have 25-minute tutor times that these can slot into. So I know I'll need to be quite swift getting through the content, but you might also want to you could take them and kind of put them into 2 longer lessons. And you know, of course, what we want you to do is enjoy making them your own, basically. In terms of how in the lessons you might hear from students and check their understanding, in my school and in my trust, mini whiteboards are standard, and the slides often suggest pairs of students putting their responses on these. The good thing about mini whiteboards is that they offer a really good way to ensure the whole class is actively taking part, and it offers a quick way to scan answers and share useful ones and address misconceptions. But of course, if you don't have mini whiteboards, then I'm sure you have your own tried and tested methods for eliciting student responses. But paired discussion followed by hands down questioning would work just as well. Also, you know, holding up numbers of fingers to correspond to points they agree with or similar would be some other ways to garner what they're thinking. A note of caution about the quantity of text on slides. You might find them a little text heavy. That's because we hope that teachers will be able to kind of just pick them up and run with them regardless of their prior knowledge. And so we've kind of tried to put everything you need on each slide. So again, we'd encourage you to remove anything you think you could explain without text. And sometimes you might not want to set all the tasks on there. And then the format of every lesson goes like this. Before each one, there's a skipped slide with a set of notes with a lesson overview and suggested timings. Then the first slide for students has a title, a learning intention, and a task for students to complete by themselves as you register them, if that's what happens in your school. And then the slides after have a range of interactive activities. There's generally a short writing task towards the end and a final slide recapping what they've done and giving a heads up about the next lesson. So I'm going to go through the first lesson, and as I do that, I'll say what's in it and also a bit about the approach I might take while I'm teaching them. Might be a little long-winded, but don't worry, I'm just going to do that for the first one, and then I'll hand over to the experts who are going to be probably more compelling in terms of the actual content. Okay, right. So the first lesson introduces the students to the idea that the climate crisis can be considered a human rights crisis. You can see here the slide with the learning intention, which says, today we're going to explore the idea that your rights as a young person, today we're going to explore your rights, the idea that your rights as a young person, oh, it doesn't even make sense. That needs editing. Sorry, we're going to explore your rights as a young person so that we can consider whether the climate and nature crisis infringes upon them. Okay, and there's a little task there to get them thinking about which rights they can remember. The following slide tells them about the summit, and it would be a good idea for you to have a look through all the things that are on and maybe think about what you're excited about and what you might mention there. The events that week, 2nd of June to 8th of June, many of them are virtual, lots of them are in person. Absolutely incredible opportunities, particularly for sixth form students. So encourage them to get out there into the city and to get involved. But that is a kind of have a look and adapt slide for sure. Then the lesson properly begins with this slide, which refreshes their memory of some of the rights from the Universal Declaration. And they're chosen because they're the ones that climate is directly impinging upon in many parts of the world. If I were teaching this slide, I might encourage them to pick just one right to apply the question at the bottom to, so that they have time to think properly about one thing rather than vaguely about several. I'd also get them to complete most tasks in pairs, as that makes it faster to review their opinions and they'll be more confident to come up with those ideas. Okay, so next slide. In order to focus on protecting their rights as young people, the lesson then turns to some of the rights of the child. Again, I think I might break this task down by giving 3 questions to 3 different parts of the class. And then the final task is a menu of statements. Here you need to make it clear that they need to go with the statement that feels right and manageable to them. So you could see it might be, they might feel like it's quite easy to talk about how the climate and nature crisis gets in the way of their daily life. Because they can talk kind of practically about things that happen every day. Maybe there's a heat wave and they're finding it uncomfortable to sleep. But if they want to write on a more conceptual level, then they might go to the last one, the climate and nature crisis infringes on my human rights, and then they can bring in the ideas they've developed in the class. It's probably helpful if you're modelling on the board as you do that, what you might do. So, and maybe give them some more sentence starters. And then you can see this is one of the kind of just recap and heads up slides. So that's what we've done today. This is what you'll do next time. Okay, so that's lesson 1, and the others follow the basic format. I'm going to give you a quicker overview of the content of lesson 2, and then Travis is going to come in with some considerations for how you might explain and explore climate justice. We're hoping that this webinar is going to not just kind of, you know, spell out what's on every slide, but actually give you some deeper contextual knowledge so that you can really enjoy exploring the topics with confidence with your students in your classes. Okay, so the learning intention for the second lesson reads, today we're going to investigate the concept of climate justice so that we can ask the question, how do we make the situation fairer for young people? And to get to that idea, we kind of go through 2 different areas of thought. So we begin with a global example to help them start thinking about how countries that played almost no part in causing human-caused climate change will have to bear the brunt of it. And this is illustrated by introducing them to Kiribati, which is how you pronounce the island's name. And if you don't know, it's a South Pacific island that is threatened by sea level rise. And this is explained alongside information about actions the Kiribati people are taking to mitigate it. Again, kind of trying to keep the emphasis on fixing and being proactive, before showing students information about relative average CO2 emissions per person in 5 different countries, including Kiribati. So note, the countries there chosen there could be changed. There's a large Pakistani community in my school, so that was one of my choices. So that information is then complicated on the next slide by historic emissions, and then suddenly you see the UK's contribution goes right up. The middle bit of the lesson then turns their attention to a more local climate issue, flooding in Oxford, and how the impacts of that are unfairly distributed, because the people who are worst affected are those who may already be on the margins of society. And the last bit of the lesson then brings them to the idea that within then even the oldest and the youngest people in society are especially vulnerable. So that's introducing them to climate justice and as a kind of global concept, and then kind of narrowing in to try and make it as relevant to them. And you know, wherever you may be teaching this, it might be that you have a really nice example for your local area. I think flooding's a good one for Oxford, but you might want to swap in something else. But Travis, over to you to talk a bit more about climate justice and take us a bit further with that.
Thanks, Vivi. Great lesson series. Really exciting. So I think the main thing we're trying to kind of do, this through line that we've taken us through from now, we have these rights as young people, and they might be being infringed upon, is to get to this idea of justice. And I think when we were first, Phoebe and I were talking about this, it was really kind of hard to nail down what we meant by this. So I've had the opportunity to teach about climate justice to grade 6s, so that's about 11-year-olds, all the way to teacher candidates, so people in professional school. And one thing that always is really helpful is just a kind of a basic definition. So this is one that's worked well for me in the context in which I've taught. So the idea that justice is an uneven and or unfair impact of climate change across socioeconomic and geographic positions. And the key here is impact can be both positive and negative. And then there's also an element of an unequal ability to actually influence those impacts. So say these things are happening, that's fine, but can you actually do something about them? That's another element of justice. So as our lesson shows, starting with a global example is always a good idea. So with Kiribati, as we've showed you, there's very little per person per year emissions, and they also have been one of the least historical emitters, and yet they're getting impacted by climate change potentially the most. And they also have very little ability to actually do anything about this, aside from like UN resolutions and pairing up with other island nations like we've seen in the Caribbean in recent years. And when you talk to students about this, it's fairly obvious to them that this is an unfair thing. What's useful then is to then spin it to, I think, them and then their context. So for them specifically, there's the idea that the consequences and benefits of climate change will actually be unequal to them as young people by virtue of their age, right? Young people are going to be around with climate change longer. They're going to be more impacted by the deleterious effects, both physically and mentally. And they likely have little power in ways to ameliorate this, being just maybe not able to vote or involved in their political system. When you turn to the local issue itself, then we can really get stuff to fly. So in my region of Niagara, which is in quite a fertile area of Ontario in Canada, there are some projections we have for average mean temperature, going to get hotter, precipitation, more rain, and then annual hot days. And when you talk to students about this, they really start to recognize that this is going to have some big impacts on their way of life. Being an agricultural center in Niagara, food insecurity is going to be a thing, job insecurity as our crops change, water eutrophication, ecological gentrification is something these students mention a lot as well. Who's going to actually get access to these ecological areas as they get harder to come to? Becomes really easy for these students with these examples to articulate and understand these concepts of justice. Now, often when you start talking about these things, and we prompt it in these lessons itself, is, okay, this is not fair. What do you do about it, right? And that's where a little bit of background information, I think, becomes helpful. So one of the first ways that I found it's helpful to think about what do you do about these things is to make sure you can frame something so that you can name it and you can pick it apart. So these types of justice are from some UN documents that talk about the just transition. And they talk about 3 different types. So they talk about procedural, which is who participates in the decision making, distributional, how are the costs and benefits allocated, and then recognitional, who's actually being brought into these conversations and recognized for these types of issues. And we've seen all these, how they play out with Kiribati, but then you can actually take them and put them under, say, something like young people, the intergenerational justice. So for an example here, right, young people might not be able to participate. They might be impacted more, and they might not even be recognized as having a voice, right? So all those kind of justice areas can fit into different types of justice, just as a way to help frame and help you understand what's going on with your students, and then thinking about how we can address it. Epistemic one is one I'm particularly interested in. That's the idea of student knowledge and how young people's knowledge is valued. But for more information, we have some references here to the side that take a really good hit at what justice looks like, and especially for young people. When you then kind of have a framing, it often comes down to, okay, what do we do about this teacher? And this one, there's a lot of different ways to do this, but one I've been really drawn to is this kind of triptych, this diagram I've adapted from a few other folks. But it's the idea that in climate education, we can educate about climate change, for climate action, and for climate justice. And then there's these little alliterations at the bottom that help you kind of understand the flavor of it. So education about climate change is about doing things better. Education for climate action is about doing better things. And education for climate justice is doing things differently. I think that's really important because kind of the mess we find ourselves in, we need to think about systemic change, transformational change, which is doing things differently. So an example is important. So when talking about Kiribati, potentially education about climate change would be talking about how much the sea level rises, why it's doing so, maybe the rate at which certain land pieces will disappear, right? Doom and gloom narrative kind of embedded in that, really learning about the issue. For climate action is actually what's going on in these areas and how can we help, right? Are we talking about those mangrove forests we talk about? Is it more community action? Are there community things we can do? But climate justice is doing things differently. And that would be about the conversation of reparations, right? Do countries that are more responsible for climate change, can they foot the bill for these things happening to other countries? And I think that's a good way that I've used to think about what am I actually doing as I think about justice and think about addressing it. And then final plug is the NAAEE, so the North American Association of Environmental Education, has a really good booklet about climate justice, and they have some pedagogies there that you can think about to engage in these different justice approaches. Okay so far? Yeah, okay, cool, thank you. So from there, we've kind of set these students up with, okay, there's these justice elements. We're asking you to do things differently, right? Transformational. So we want to give them an option of that. And that is where we get into the idea of litigation. So this is our opening slide, where we kind of talk through what you might need to know as a teacher in teaching it, and then we'll get into the actual substance of those lessons. So the first one, again, we always kind of hark back in these lessons to the previous one. So this one asks you to think about Article 12 of the UN Convention of Rights of the Child. And then we're asking these students to actually note down, do you think your views are taken seriously in the climate crisis? This is a leading question, right? It's gonna be very easy for students to say no and get all riled up. We encourage you as an educator to think about ways their voices are heard. But where we're kind of trying to steer this conversation is the idea that litigation is a way that your views could potentially be taken seriously. So we introduced the concept of litigation through a few cases. There's some graphics here about just kind of the youth climate litigation movement and how it's been really taking off in the past decade. Over here, we have the kind of landmark, one that most people I think talk about in North America, at least. This is the Held versus Montana Supreme Court case. And then one very near and dear to my heart in Ontario, which we'll talk about quite extensively, about Mather versus Ontario. So after introducing the concept of climate litigation, we're going to do a little bit of a history lesson on it. So we're going to define it. That's just this material issue of that climate change law, policy, or science is a material issue of law or fact. And that there's been a lot of cases since the Paris Climate Agreement. And then we're going to give a little bit of a way to think about these different waves of litigation that have happened. So the first wave, starting in kind of the 1980s, is really focusing on environmental and planning laws. So this is where these claimants are arguing that governments or companies didn't consider a planning law when they made something. The second wave is one that we're really interested in this kind of lesson series. It's the idea that climate inaction can violate human rights. So like the right to life, health, or culture. And we'll come back to this. And then the third one is more about a fiduciary duty of companies and corporations. So the idea that corporations may make false or misleading claims about the impacts of climate change on business and investments, and that's not something they're allowed to do to their shareholders. We follow this up with a little activity. So can you take the arguments and match them to the different waves? All of these arguments are from real cases that you could find on various kind of litigation websites. We can provide those for you. And then we kind of get to the actual example of one. Oh, no, sorry. Then we get to talking about why wave 2 is actually really, really useful to think about youth-led action. So we're going to try to problematize the idea that wave 2 is specifically useful for youth. And again, this ties back to the justice concepts a bit. So the idea that youth have more time to enjoy their rights, they're probably more vulnerable to them, and this might make claims for, say, charter infringement a little bit more applicable in courts. All right. Then we'll get to an example. So this example is about Mather and Ontario. So this was a group of young people, the youngest of them being 12 years old. They took the Ontario government to court when they decided to make a less strict climate action plan. And they argued they would and are being disproportionately harmed by this government policy. And in the next lesson, we'll go into this case a little bit more. But for this kind of preview specifically, what we want to do is good practice with eco-anxiety and the idea that as we talk to youth about these topics, it's important to paint some positive of this, but also some realism. So the success story from Mather versus Ontario was that the government of Ontario tried to dismiss Mather, and they claimed that their policies on climate were meaningless, which is a really bold thing to say by a government. And then the judge actually said that, no, that can't be true. You have to have real impact. So this was a really big deal in Ontario, the idea that our climate policies actually now must have a real impact. But the realism here is that this case has gone through a motion to dismiss and appeal since 2019. So our youngest person in this litigation avenue, Mather, who's 12, is now 18 and going to university, right? So this takes a long time. And the idea that this takes a long time and a lot of money and might be kind of these incremental steps really begs the question, how great is litigation as an avenue to get to justice? So we end with a task actually thinking about this, like, is litigation a really important tool, or are there some drawbacks of it? And this is a complex issue, and to take us a little bit through the pluses and minuses of litigation, how we can think about that from a justice lens, we're going to hand it over to Isabella.
Thanks, Travis. Good morning, everyone. I'm calling in from New Zealand, so it's early in the morning here. As Travis has discussed in this lesson plan on climate justice, and as kind of we've explored generally in this discussion, there is ample evidence to suggest the importance of teaching about climate justice and the value that teaching climate justice specifically through litigation brings. And to hone this point, an existing body of scholarship suggests that integrating climate justice within climate change litigation education does not only drive educational engagement among learners, but it also provides a pathway for them into more participatory climate action. It makes climate change seem less abstract, such that young people are able to resonate. And I quote McGregor and Christie, their 2021 paper here, where it enables them to recognise the disproportionate negative impact that climate change would have on their own material living conditions. But as Travis alluded to, of course, there are some downfalls. On one hand, the teaching of justice through the lens of climate litigation is important. There is potential in that teaching to equate climate justice with litigation, that they go hand in hand. And I'm going to allude to a couple of examples, and I'll point to the pictures on the screens where climate justice has been a struggle that has not just been relied in terms of, or litigation has not just been relied on as the primary cause of action. In the teaching of climate justice through climate litigation, whilst it is important to teach about the power and the successes of litigation, and there are numerous examples that we can point to, so too is it important to talk about, as Travis said, the time and the cost involved in litigation, and the fact there may actually be more beneficial forms and causes of action that we could lean on in certain situations. The key message, I think, to emphasize here and in the discussions with your students, and even just in enhancing your understanding climate justice and climate litigation is that the struggle of climate justice does not rest with actions of the individual. It is a collective and relational struggle which ultimately serves to address power inequities that underlie in our society. And as I mentioned, I'm going to point out 4 examples of climate justice that I've kind of captured in these photos, where climate litigation is not the primary tactic or cause of action, but have been really successful in their own right. The top left, is a photo of an Indigenous land reclamation about 5 minutes from where I currently am. It's called Ihumātao. And the return of stolen land to Indigenous control and occupation reflects both the ancestral relationship between Indigenous people and the land, the disproportionate impact that climate change will have on Indigenous people, and the importance of strengthening Indigenous solutions to climate change. Whilst of course litigation has been used, it was used as part of the overall kind of scheme that was involved in this land reclamation. It actually wasn't the one that ultimately brought resolution. It was people occupying the land, and through political change, really led by people power. The next are community gardens, and this may seem like a really local example, but it is important in terms of local community climate action. And the food sovereignty movement has come out of really successful community organising projects. They play a vital role in soil regeneration, addressing food deserts, and issues related to community resilience. Diplomacy, of course, is another avenue for climate justice. Often we can dismiss it as necessarily being a fruitful tool for justice, but one of the articles of the landmark Paris Agreement I'm sure you are all aware of is the loss and damage article, and the creation of the Loss and Damage Fund to provide financial assistance to nations such as Kiribati that Phoebe mentioned earlier, who are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and have caused the least. And finally, political mobilisation, organising, campaigning, including political protest. You'll all be familiar with the Fridays for Future movement that was started by young people around the world. So I'll hand back to Travis from these examples. Thank you.
Thanks, Isabella. That was great. I saw some people nodding along in the group about the food sovereignty movement. So that is wonderful. I got a big garden in my backyard as well, which is actually next to a school. So trying to keep it going. Perfect. So from there, with this kind of new insights about climate justice and its intersection with litigation, we try to move on to actually how evidence might work in this area. So there's a fun, I think some of the titles of this work is about this idea from lab room to courtroom to classroom. And I think what we've done in these lessons is kind of reverse it a bit, right? We've talked about human rights and then justice and then litigation and the evidence for it. But now what we're going to get into is this evidence, where does that come from, and how can we actually learn more about it? So the opening slide here is about some things to consider, I guess, again, about the lessons themselves. And then we get into our overarching kind of beginning of session 4, where we're going to investigate how evidence is used in litigation to prove plaintiff's claims and get relief. And we're going to get a little more technical in this lesson, really starting to introduce some new language. So definitely something to go over before you dive in. So the way we start, again, we're going to herald back to the Mather versus Ontario case. We're going to think a little bit about then even further back to the beginning about Article 24 of the UN Convention of Rights of the Child, which is that you are going to get the best possible health, including access to safe drinking water, nutritious food, and a clean and safe environment. And then we're going to ask the students, how could we prove that climate change is harming your rights and specifically this right? So I've done this with some grade 6s actually near me recently, and some really, really great conversations they have about this and how they think about evidence and what that might actually look like. My favorite one was that my mom told me. Depending on where we go, we might get different ones here. But for the next, what we're going to introduce is a little bit more of some of the some language around this. So we're going to say that in a legal area, you plaintiff are going to need to use evidence to link what's happening, some action, to the harm that's being caused. And you as the plaintiff have the burden of proof. Okay, so you have to say it's more likely than not that the evidence and arguments are valid and need to be accepted. And then we're going to get a critical thinking task here to ask the students to actually think about the evidence they talked about, like the note from their mom. Would this stand up in court, right? Is this evidence robust enough that we can actually do something with this? Have a great conversation there before we then go back to Mather and introduce how they tried to show this burden of proof. So for the Mather case specifically, the youth gave an example. So they had to testify with personal experience that climate change was harming their rights to life and security of the person as the two charter rights that they were taking the Ontario government over. So this was through written affidavits. So they actually wrote some pieces to kind of show these harms. And then this case also relied on an expert witness that tried to testify about climate change and its impacts that linked government action to the climate change and then to harms. And this individual was Dr. Matthews. So he actually provided evidence that more greenhouse gases would lead to increased wildfires, storms, and flooding in Ontario. And he used his scientific methods and processes to prove harm. And what was nice about this case is that the judge actually agreed. So I'll get you to read this quote by Stephen Wood that quotes directly from the decision the judge made. A really exciting way that we're kind of seeing this process of science being used to adjudicate something the government's doing and the judge agreeing. And this is happening more and more. So this idea of taking this causal chain of harm, right? This idea that we have some like government inaction causing harm, we need relief, is getting a whole scientific field around it. And then this is what we use with, it's called attribution science. And in these legal cases, it's generally used to say, hey, you caused this mess, so you should clean it up. And we're having scientific evidence being increasingly relied upon to show how climate change worsens heat waves, droughts, wildfires, and floods, and how higher temperature can actually cause more extreme rainfall. Now with the students, now that we've kind of introduced this, we're going to get a little bit even more fine-grained and into it. And we're going to talk about how attribution science tries to work. And this is through modeling. And what they're trying to do here is to say that we're going to compare a world without climate change to the world we have to look at the likelihood and severity of extreme weather events. So over here, we have a normal distribution in the graph, so these two bumpy lines. The solid line is our new climate, and our bumpy line is one without climate change. And we can see that as we shift this temperature distribution, we're going to get more hot weather and more extreme weather events. Okay, so this modeling tries to show how much more likely or intense an event was because of climate change. Now, of course, with all things science, this is a process, right? And it is tentative, right? So we actually have some, it's difficult to always establish these strong causal connections between anthropogenic climate change and every event. So we have this graph over here that shows on the x-axis understanding of the effect of climate change on the event. And then the y-axis is the effect of anthropogenic climate change on the event. And we can see we're pretty confident with extreme heat and extreme cold, but less confident with other events like this. So because this is a complex topic, and the idea of a process of science being used to make policy then being adjudicated by a judiciary, we're going to have our resident attribution scientist expert, Shireen, to come on and tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, hi, thank you, Travis. That was really good. I think you explained that really well as a non-attribution scientist as well.
Thank you. Thank
you. So as you already mentioned, it can be quite difficult to really prove that something is an event is changed by climate change. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. But that's really where attribution science comes from as well. It comes from the field of science that is trying to prove that the global climate change that we're observing is caused by human emissions. And actually, we talked about the Oxford flooding earlier, and that's really where attribution came from, because in 2003, the Oxford professor Miles Ellen wrote a short commentary for Nature about his house being flooded in Oxford and wondering whether it would ever be possible to sue anyone for the damage that has been caused. But to explain a little bit more about the intricacies of attribution science, I thought I'd take you through kind of the chain that you'd have to go through as a scientist, and that like kind of showing that it includes a lot of careful consideration of what kind of event you're actually looking at. So first of all, you would look at the event. Something bad has happened. Maybe people have died from a heat wave. And you would really have to decide, okay, why was this event impactful? Was it just the temperatures, for example, when we're talking about a heat wave, or was it the temperature and the associated humidity that was really bad? But making that choice about what kind of climatic variables you're looking at can really make a difference in those cases. And then also really clearly defining what area you're looking at. Usually, especially with the kind of climate data that we do have, the smaller scale you look at, if you look at a small city, that's going to be incredibly hard. If you look at a whole country, that is possibly more feasible. And then we have to really carefully consider what kind of question we're actually interested in. Are we interested in how the likelihood of similar events are changing, or how the severity of the event is changing? So are we interested in whether the event will occur every 5 years now instead of every 10 years? Or are we more interested in whether the event was 2 degrees hotter, for example, because of climate change? And that really then has an impact on what kind of method you're choosing for your attribution study. And I would really like to stress that different methods can make a huge difference in the type of results that you're getting. And that can often lead to the fact that people would see multiple attribution studies in the news, for example, even come up with different results for the attribution study. But that's because of these subtle differences in the questions that we're asking about the event and how people define the event, where they see maybe the impact and yeah, which variables they chose for that. And then we can go into actually using the event attribution as evidence in those legal cases, with the caveats that we have made very careful consideration about what kind of method we want to use, what our event definition is, and that is not necessarily set in stone, but needs to be chosen for the use case that we have in mind. At the moment, that kind of science is really done by a lot of scientists across the world, especially in Europe and America and New Zealand. It is done by scientists at universities, but also at National Met Services. And there's a huge movement at the moment to kind of operationalize that science. So, the weather forecast that you're getting every day on your phones or on the television, and there's a huge movement to make it possible for weather forecasters to show us attribution with that weather forecast as well. And that will then hopefully hugely help as well with kind of the justice issue in the distribution of event attribution studies. So slightly different justice issue that we might have talked about before, because there is obviously this huge discussion in the UN at the moment about loss and damage and kind of helping developing nations with the burden of climate impacts. But distributing that money is often, people might want to rest that decision based on attribution studies. And if we mainly have attribution studies for the global north, where a lot of the research scientists are resident, then that can create an unbalance in the distribution of that money as well. So yeah, hopefully attribution science will spread in its use as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Shireen. That's great. So I really hope you're seeing the connections here between all these lessons and how painstaking it is to think about doing these in 20 minutes. Really, I think we can have a full week of study or a unit with some of these ideas as we work through them. So thank you for that, Shireen. So we close this lesson after having a little bit about that conversation, just getting students to think about a causal chain of harm from a real case in Australia. This one is really, really, I think, interesting. Isabella and I talked about this one quite a bit. This was an 86-year-old guardian who's also a nun. So it's a very colorful case that is written about quite well in a lot of areas, but that has a very clean kind of way of attributing certain actions to harm, which is what this suit was actually about. So from there, we then take students, we've kind of summed up these more content-heavy areas, and we're going to get to our final lesson now on thinking about how could you participate, potentially not as a young person, but through something like careers. So to talk a little bit more about that, I'm going to hand it back over to Phoebe.
Thanks. Yeah, I completely agree. I hope that thinking about these 5 shorts kind of is getting those of you that are teachers thinking about how interesting it would be to have longer form units and to really be running this through your curriculum with all the various angles. you can take. So the last lesson is focused on careers, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because one way to help students feel able to engage with the climate and nature crisis without weighing them down with worry is to clearly point out interesting and ambitious possibilities in work that addresses it. And the second one is because careers are one of the 4 components in the UK of the Department for Education Sustainable Education Strategy. So delivering this session will go towards meeting their requirements. And that's, that's something that curriculum supervisors can feel positive about. Okay, I'll just run through it really quickly because I'm looking forward to the Q&A we're going to have after this. But the lesson begins with how to train to become a lawyer. And it then gets them to think about how you go about specializing. And what's good about that is it's important to help young people realize that to follow any particular career takes more than just completing the training. It's something that you shape and develop, and that you kind of ideally might build around your strengths and your interests, and you have to have your eyes open to all the opportunities that speak to those interests. So it goes on to get them to think about which courses would prepare them to take on cases in each of the 3 waves of climate litigation that they learnt about in lesson 3. And then we profile an inspiring climate lawyer, Haj Narula, so that they can put a face to a profession and see that's real, and see some of the incredible things that he has done or is doing. We follow that straight away with a profile of an inspiring climate scientist, Mireia Ginesta, and again to give them a role model and to make it feel real. And then similar to the law slides, we go over some pathways to becoming a climate scientist, just sketch those out. And then they're asked to match scientific study to the litigation cases that study would allow you to be an expert witness at. And then finally, students are asked to imagine being either a climate scientist or a climate lawyer, and to write down why this would be interesting work. And of course, this exercise may only be genuine for a few of them, but it's important to encourage all students to undertake thought experiments about following all kinds of different careers, just to plant the idea that all kinds of different futures are open to them, whoever they are. So that's the final lesson, wrapping it all up. The idea today was really to help teachers feel confident about delivering these lessons. I know that as a teacher, I love being able to study and deepen my subject knowledge, and I hardly ever get time to do that. So I've really enjoyed hearing from our experts, Isabella and Shireen and Travis. And I know that when I go to teach these, I feel I'm kind of better informed and able to expand about all the different topics. And I think they're going to be a real pleasure to teach. And I hope you'll enjoy teaching them too. So that's all from me for now. I'm going to hand back to Travis, but with thanks to all of you for coming and everyone taking part.